Welcome to the Max Future Weekly Podcast. All Apple talk and no chit chat.
Okay, welcome to the Apple Podcast by Lex at Max Future, and today is September 2nd, 2011, and this is an Apple-related podcast, and there's no chit-chat, and it's all Apple talk. So let's get right to it, and there's a lot to talk about that's interesting. So here we go. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is answer a question that someone posted on my YouTube channel regarding my podcast regarding the MacBook Air. That's podcast episode number 82. And he had a question, and I started answering it, but you can only answer so much of it on the YouTube comment page. And you know what? I thought this is a good question. There might be listeners out there who really are struggling with what kind of Mac or what kind of computing device to buy, and this is what the question relates to. So here's the question. Hello, I was wondering if you could help me. I'm thinking of getting either an iMac, a MacBook Pro, or a MacBook Air. Would you recommend the MacBook Air? You don't find the screen very small? I love the portability of the laptop, but I want to be able to relax and sit back when I'm at home. I love this about the big screen. I was wondering if you could give me any help or guidance as of what products to choose. Thank you, Jim. Okay, so this is Jim's question, and I wrote back, Jim, that is a tough question. I have both an 11-inch MacBook Air and a 27-inch iMac. I love them both. I find the 11-inch screen to be fine, but I wouldn't want to do a lot of movie editing on it, although I have done a lot of screencast editing on the Air. If you aren't going to have two computers, you could get the MacBook Air and get a 27-inch Thunderbolt display, so when you're at home you have a much bigger screen. I will cover your issue in tomorrow's podcast. Good question. That's today. So really, he does pose a good question, and I think a lot of people are going to have that question. So the first thing you have to ask yourself is, well, what kind of Mac, or how many Macs can you get? What is your budget? Okay, because if you have an unlimited budget, you can buy as many Macs as you want. But let's assume you have a limited budget. Well, I guess it comes down to this. If you could only get one computer, just one computer, then ask yourself, how do you plan to use it? Now, let's say you're a family guy and you're just going to have one computer, or if you're a family guy and you've got kids and you're into taking photos and you're into movie editing, well, I would say get the iMac, because the iMac is the best value and will give you the hardware you need for things like video editing and photo editing. Because, well, first of all, the new Macs, let's see, they start off at just a little over $1,000. So with no discount, and some corporations or schools or government employees get a little teeny bit of a discount from Apple, but not a lot. But the prices start off at $1,200 with no discount for a 21.5-inch iMac. Now that's a pretty big monitor. And the thing is, so if you're into movie or video editing and you plan to do a lot, you really you want both the storage and the power of an iMac, because the iMacs can store a lot and they also have a lot of power. Now, the power is going to be driven by the processor and the video card. So the very basic model comes with a 2.5 gigahertz quad-core Intel Core i5 processor. Now, that's a mouthful, but it is a much more powerful processor than, let's say, a MacBook Air. Okay, because let's go to the MacBook Airs. Now, the MacBook Airs, they start off in pricing at $1,000, $999. And for that, you get a 1.6 gigahertz dual-core Intel Core i5 processor with 2 gigabytes of RAM and 64 gigabytes of storage. But the thing is, the processor is just not going to be that powerful. The i5, and there are these Geekbench scores, and I have a higher end 11 inch, and that gets like, I don't know, like close to 5,500 or 6,000 score. The brand new 11 inch iMac Air, I got the one that's also an i5 core processor, 1.6 gigahertz, and my last year's iMac quad core i7 gets almost like double the Geek Score bench. On the other hand, there's other reasons why I think if you're just going to have one computer, again, if you're just going to have one computer and editing movies, home movies, and photos, lots of photos, let's say you want to deal with a lot of photos, I'd go with an iMac because it's a great base station. And this is if you're like a homebody and you just want that. And so again, you can get this great value, the iMac. Now, the other reason you want to get the iMac is storage, because movies and photos take up a lot of room. And the MacBook Air, I love my MacBook Air, but it's not my main machine. And the bottom entry MacBook Air has only 64 gigabytes of storage, and it uses a flash storage, which is known as an SSD drive. And you can get for $1,200, which is the same price as the entry level iMac, you can get an 11-inch Air with double the storage of 128 gigabytes. So, but let's look, for that same price, you're going to get an iMac with 500 gigabytes hard drive. Now, it's a slower hard drive that's in the MacBook Air, but you get like almost, I'd say more than 3 times the storage of the MacBook Air. And the other thing is you just have more connections. The MacBook Air has two USB connections and a Thunderbolt connection. Now, Thunderbolt is very fast, but there aren't a lot of external hard drives that work with Thunderbolt. And USB is not bad for an external connection. But the thing is, if you're going to, again, and I'm emphasizing this choice, if you plan to edit a lot of home movies or take a lot of home movies and photos. So I'd go with the iMac for that reason, because you have more storage, more power for home movie editing and photos. You can also add a lot of RAM. The MacBook Air, I think, is limited to 4 gigabytes of RAM. The entry-level iMac, which is 21.5 inches, can be expanded to 8 gigabytes of RAM, which is, pretty decent. And the thing is, you can expand up the iMac line. So, for example, if you spend another $300 and spend $1,500, you can get the same iMac that has a faster i7 quad core. I'm sorry, it has a faster processor speed of 2.7 gigahertz and comes with a standard 1 terabyte drive. So the storage on that is going to be something like 8 times greater than the top of the line 11-inch MacBook Air. And it also has the ability to expand the memory, the RAM, to 16 gigabytes. And if you go to Other Worlds Computing, you can get pretty cheap RAM to expand to 16 gigabytes. And also, if you wanted to, you have upgrade features, so you can get better hard drives in that 21.5-inch model. So I guess the base price is $1,500. You can instead, for $150 more, get a 2 terabyte hard drive internally. You can also, if you wanted to really speed up the performance for basic stuff that you do on the iMac, you could get a solid-state drive put in by Apple and keep either the 1 terabyte hard drive or the 2 terabyte hard drive. Now, one of the reasons that the MacBook Airs are so amazing is that they only have solid state drives in them. And solid state drives really speed up the performance of your computer. What a lot of people don't realize is you could have a blazing fast processor, but for daily tasks, you have to access data that's on your hard drive. Well, the traditional hard drives, the speeds of accessing that data aren't that fast. They're like, I don't know, 50, 60, 70, 80 megabytes per second. But if you have a solid state drive, they just work much quicker. So my MacBook Air has a solid state drive, and I get speeds of like 230, 240 megabytes per second, which just, even though the MacBook Air has a slower processor than my iMac, it just feels really zippy in terms of opening up apps and stuff like that. So look, if you have the money, and the problem is it's kind of pricey, I'd get the iMac and throw in, you could go with the 1 terabyte hard drive and throw in a 256 solid state drive. It comes to $2,000. The other thing you could do is a third-party company, Otherworld Computing, can put in a second drive, and they charge a lot less. So if you're going to go the iMac route, you might want to consider going the route of going to this third-party company, Otherworld Computing. And I'll here, if you're watching the video version, is I'll go to their website. They now support upgrades to the 2011 iMac. So you can go there, and they even do it for the 21.5-inch iMac. So you can, let's see, you can go there and add in a 120 gigabyte Mercury Electra 6G SSD drive for $319. Now what you can do is you can ship it, you can order online from Apple, but before, go to OWC and you buy this upgrade feature, and you call them up and you say you want to have it shipped directly from Apple to them. They'll put in the SSD drive. While their SSD drive is not as big as the SSD drive from Apple, it's faster because the technology uses something called 6G and Apple uses 3G. And 6G for SSD drives have much faster read-write speeds. They can go well above 500 megabytes per second. So they're double the speed in terms of SSD speeds that Apple puts in. And Apple could put in a 6G SSD drive, but for now they haven't done so. So what you do is you go to OWC and you buy this upgrade for, let's say, $319, and then you get the code to put, when you order from Apple, you say, Apple, I want it shipped to OWC. Here's, the code that you have to put in so the OWC knows it's from you. And then OWC puts in this whatever upgrade feature you want. They can also put in the RAM for you. Like I mentioned, OWC has cheaper RAM than what Apple has. So to upgrade to a 16 gigabyte, Apple was charging hundreds of dollars more. OWC is charging $160 more. So you can go, you can add that in too. And then the beauty is OWC will send it to you back. Now, there is this question of this violate your warranty, but if you want peace of mind, you can get, for the same price that Apple charges, an extended warranty from OWC of $169, and you get another 2 years on top of your 1 year warranty. So if you wanted peace of mind, you can get a warranty. So anyways, look, so what I'm saying is, okay, if you're going to be doing heavy duty stuff like editing video and movies, go with the iMac and consider upgrading to an SSD drive either through Apple or through OWC. Now the other thing you can do if you really think the iMac's the way to go is you can get the 27-inch iMac, and that's what I have at home. And the 27-inch iMac, let's see how much that costs. That entry level is $1,700. So we are starting to get pricier, and you get also faster processors. You get, you can upgrade to have better video RAM. If you're opening a lot, like zillions of windows on your Mac, or playing any sort of video games, having extra RAM, video RAM is good. Okay, now let's talk about scenario 2. Scenario 2 is you're not a big video taker and video editing, and you don't really do crazy stuff with pictures. Rather, you're into consuming videos, watching videos, surfing the internet, doing email, doing video chatting. Now, here I would consider, and let's say also, not only are you not going to have any other Mac, you're not going to have an iPad, right? Because let's say, so you're just going to have one computing device, and you're trying to figure out what kind of Mac should you get, or what kind of iPad. Now, I would say if you're not really a heavy computer content creator, but rather a content consumer, I would say consider getting a MacBook Air or an iPad. Now, why do I say that? Well, Jim's question went to, he likes the portability of a laptop, but he also likes to sit back and watch a big screen. Now, let's take the MacBook Air. The MacBook Air, what I like about the MacBook Air is that it's very fast. It just goes on and off very quickly. I have the 11-inch. I don't find the screen too small because, remember, you're sitting close to it. On the other hand, there are ways that you can hook up your MacBook Air to an external monitor. One way is to buy Apple's new Thunderbolt display, which is a 27-inch display. It costs a pricey $1,000, and it takes several weeks to get it. But the beauty of it is that you are connected by the Thunderbolt cable to a 27-inch display. And Apple has a special cable. Let's go to displays here. The shipping time now is 2 to 3 weeks for the Thunderbolt display. But the beauty of the Thunderbolt display is that it has lots of connections. So it could be your docking station. So you could get your MacBook Air, and when you're home, you could dock it to the Thunderbolt display, and then the Thunderbolt display also has a USB 2.0 port, a FireWire 800 port, a gigabit Ethernet port, and I believe you can daisy chain this to your MacBook Air. Now, the MacBook Air doesn't have a FireWire port. It has 2 USB 2.0 ports, and it doesn't have an Ethernet port. But I think if you connect your MacBook Air by the Thunderbolt connection, you can then connect to these other connections, like the Ethernet, like the FireWire 800. So it's like an ultimate docking station. It says here, with just one cable, connect any Thunderbolt-enabled Mac and get 27 inches of high-resolution screen space, high-quality audio, a FaceTime HD camera, FireWire 800, and gigabit Ethernet ports, and a Thunderbolt port you can use to daisy chain additional high performances. So one route to go is to get this 27-inch display and get the MacBook Air. And then what I would do, and again, this is if you have a decent budget, is connect external hard drives to the Thunderbolt display. And that could be your docking thing. And so you could have a scenario where You decide you're only going to use your movie editing and saving apps and your photo saving apps when you're docked to the 27-inch iMac. So what you could do is say, okay, and then put your iPhoto library on an external hard drive and your movie library on an external hard drive connected to the display. And when you come back and you plug in your and launch iPhoto, it knows where the library is on these external displays. So that would be another route, which is you have just the MacBook Air and this huge display. And also the MacBook Air, through the adapters, you can connect them to other cheaper displays that are big. But what I like about the Thunderbolt connection is that it's very fast and also has a connection to it that will also power and charge your MacBook Air. So that's another route to go. However, there's a third route, which is, look, if you're really truly just a light computer user, I would consider getting an iPad 2. And I think an iPad 2 with a $99 Airport TV would address a lot of Jim's problems, or what Jim's looking for, because he likes the portability, but he also said he likes to sit back and watch a big screen. So here's the beauty of an iPad. With an iPad, you're just highly mobile. You're even more mobile than with a MacBook Air because it's lighter than the MacBook Air, significantly lighter. I'd say I think about a pound lighter or so. But the other thing is the MacBook Air, because it's a regular computer, doesn't have the extraordinary battery life of an iPad 2. The iPad 2 can be on, you can be using it, and it really just goes on and on. I mean, I go like a full 11, 10, 12 hours of using it without the battery getting sucked down. Now, the MacBook Air, when that's not plugged in and I'm using it, it's supposed to get like 5 hours, but I can see my use of the MacBook Air really drawing down the power. So if you're really into just, let's say, emailing and web browsing and reading and playing games and watching videos, as opposed to heavy writing, if you're a heavy writer, you're probably not going to be comfortable with the iPad, touch screen. It can be done, but if you're really writing a lot of stuff, a MacBook Air is a better way to go. But if you're really just writing occasionally stuff, you can buy, an external wireless keyboard that works with the iPad, and the iPad is just much better than even a MacBook Air in terms of surfing the internet, writing email, playing games, reading books, and just being mobile. It's just so much more mobile than any computer. Now, Jim mentioned, he likes to sit back and watch stuff on a big screen. Well, the iPad here also is good for that because the iPad has this technology called AirPlay. So if you get a $99 Apple TV, which looks like, it's the size of a hockey puck, you can hook that up to any big screen TV you have. And then the AirPlay technology in the iPad will let you quickly transfer a movie. The movie's going to be on your iPad, but it'll wirelessly play. If you have an Apple TV and a Wi-Fi network in your apartment or house, it'll transfer that video to the big screen TV. And I've played with that, and it's fantastic. Like if you've got your TV set to the Apple TV, you can also watch photos. You can sit back and watch photos. And now Apple's going to be releasing iOS 5 this fall. And I've played around with the beta, and iOS 5 allows you to mirror anything that's on the iPad to a big TV. So I'm not sure if I've answered Jim's question. So to recap it, I'd say it like this. If you're not a real big content creator, although you can create content on the iPad, but if you're currently, creating a lot of content with word processing on a computer or editing heavily movies and photos, I would not get the iPad. I would get actually an iMac, because I think the iMac gives you the power, the screen size, the storage for anybody who's seriously producing anything on a regular basis. If you're sometimes creating stuff and want hypermobility in a really fast computer, get the MacBook Air. And if you want a bigger screen, you can easily hook it up to another monitor or get the Thunderbolt display, which costs like $1,000, which could be your base station. Finally, but then if you're really looking for mobility and for and you're not really writing a lot, you're not really creating a lot, although again, like I said, you could use the iPad. I'd go with the iPad. Because the iPad is truly the future of computing, and the iPad only costs $500, the entry 16 gigabyte one. I just got my mom an iPad too. She finally broke down, never bought an Apple product in her life, and she said she wanted an iPad. She's been using PCs for years. So, and the other thing is the iPad is so cheap, $500, that I would suggest getting an iMac and using the iMac as your base station, and then getting a $500 iPad for the mobility, and having the iPad with the iMac. So the iMac becomes the base of your computing life, and then the iPad and even iPhone or iPod Touch become the sort of mobile devices that you have. So I hope this answered, not just Jim's question, but anybody's questions as to what to get. So anyways, let's move on. Okay, now we were talking about Macs and what kind of ports they have. And one thing that none of the Macs have are the new USB technology called USB 3.0. Apple came out with Thunderbolt in the early spring, and so the MacBook Pros, the iMacs, and the MacBook Airs, and the Mini Mac all have the Thunderbolt connection. And the Thunderbolt connection, which Intel and Apple developed together, really could be the future of high-speed connections and display connections between computers like the Mac and external devices like hard drives, storage devices, and all sorts of devices and displays. But the other part of technology that makes USB, currently we have USB 2.0. All our computers, including Macs, have USB 2.0 connections. They're developing something called USB 3.0, and you may have seen in stores hard drives that profess to be working with 3.0, USB 3.0. And word comes from the website macrumors.com now that Apple is considering installing USB 3.0 into the next Macintoshes that come out. And I made a little blog post about this, and I said this would be huge news, as Apple has installed the very advanced Thunderbolt connections in its newly released Macintoshes. So what is the difference between the two, and why have both in a new Macintosh? So here are the key differences. The Thunderbolt has a data bit rate of 10 gigabits per second. That's enormous. This rate holds both for its PCI mode and its DisplayPort mode when hooked up to a monitor. That means that even when you hook it up to a monitor, it can transfer data back and forth at 10 gigabytes per second. And the key thing is the Thunderbolt cable can send data in two directions. So this has, huge impact. Now the USB 3.0 has a rate of 5 gigabytes per second, and it also can send data back and forth at the same rate. But I'm not sure if it can be used to run a display. So, the bottom line is that Thunderbolt is going to be twice as fast as USB 3.0. But why do I think it's a good thing that they're going to put that in? because already there's a huge cottage industry in USB devices, and most consumers are familiar with USB, and so there's just going to be off the bat more hard drives made that are USB 3.0 than Thunderbolt, and so you'll also probably be able to adapt a Thunderbolt connection to have it work with USB 3.0, but a lot of people don't like little adapters and all that. So Apple's probably thinking, you know what, there hasn't been a lot of third-party companies making Thunderbolt devices. Whatever now appears in the Apple Store and other places are sort of very high-end hard drives that cost like $1,000 in RAID. We don't see the cheap, hard drives that you can get for like a 1 terabyte, $100 in a Costco. You don't see those running Thunderbolt, but you'll probably see these cheap peripheries first with USB 3.0. So Apple's probably hedging its bets, and wants to have both just to see which way the market goes. So anyways, that's good news if that happens. Okay, it looks like Apple's backing down a little bit on its stance regarding Final Cut Pro, particularly the legacy Final Cut Pro 7 Studio, which had been the Final Cut Pro edition for video editing for professionals before Final Cut 10 came out. Now, you may remember there was a lot of controversy earlier this summer when Final Cut X or Final Cut 10 was finally released, because some high-end movie editors believe that Apple sort of dumbed down the program and took away features that are critical to high-end professionals using it. And Apple also stopped offering additional licenses in the Apple Store. Well, Apple quietly, according to MacRumors.com, Apple has put the older version of the Final Cut Pro, the one that was discontinued, back on sale. And Apple issued a memo, I guess, announcing the reavailability of the product. And it cost $1,000, which I think is a lot more expensive than the only $300 for the newer Final Cut Pro. So look, the only people who really are going to care about this are really serious high-end movie editors who've been using the old version of Final Cut Pro and don't like the massive changes that have been done to Final Cut Pro X. But I'll tell you, I for years have been using iMovie. I tried to use Final Cut Express, which is the lighter version of Final Cut Studio, the previous one, and I really liked iMovie better. And Final Cut 10 is basically taking up the concept of what iMovie had, and sort of Final Cut 10 plays off of that sort of interface, and I kind of like it. I like Final Cut 10, and I like also that the price is only $300, and it's available in the Mac App Store. So if you buy it through the Mac App Store, you can put it on, I guess, up to 5 computers. Now, Final Cut Studio, the $1,000, it sounds like it's still sold only in a box and not in the Mac App Store. So you're not going to be able to put it on multiple computers like you can with the newer version. But anyways, I think it is making some professionals happy. Now, we talked a lot about Steve Jobs last week and his resignation as CEO of Apple. He's still going to be the chairman of the company and still an employee of Apple. But, it's a sad day that he's no longer CEO, because he's been CEO since, I guess, 1997. And obviously, previously, he founded Apple and was CEO or chairman in a prior period. But we got to see a bit of Steve's other life, which is his private life. And on one hand, I feel like this is kind of voyeuristic. Basically, a neighbor of Steve Jobs, where he lives, wrote an article in a magazine or newspaper called Palo Alto Patch. And he gives us some insight into what a nice neighbor Steve is. And I have a link on the blog. But it is, it is a little bit voyeuristic, but on the other hand, it's very positive about Steve. And, here's what the person says. My neighbor Steve Jobs, the person, by the way, is Lysen Stromberg, and this is at his blog, lysenstromberg.wordpress.com. He says, my neighbor Steve Jobs has been in the news lately. The talk of the town is the recent announcement he will be stepping aside to let other seeds grow at Apple. The business press, the general press, the blogosphere, and just about everybody else has waxed poetic about the greatest CEO of all time, saying that this boy wonder has shaped the very nature of our lives with his genius. It's all true, but here in Palo Alto, Steve Jobs isn't just an icon, he's also the guy who lives down the street. And he goes on to say, I first met Steve, does anyone call him Mr. Jobs anymore, years ago at a backyard pool party. I was so flummoxed by the off chance I was breathing in his DNA, I could barely say a word. I am sure I made a winning first impression as I stumbled over my own name when we were introduced. I watched as he swam in the pool with his son. He seemed like a regular guy, a good dad having fun with his kids. The next time I met him was when our children attended school together. He sat in on back to school night listening to the teacher drone on about the value of education. Wait, isn't he one of those high-tech gods who didn't even graduate from college? While the rest of us sat around and pretending having Steve Jobs in the room was totally normal. Anyways, that's the sort of gist of it. But he basically says, shows that the guy's a normal guy. He's nice to his neighbors, and he's, nice to everybody in the community, and he's not pretentious. So, anyways, check it out. It's a nice post, and it just shows the humanity of Steve Jobs. Obviously, he's a human. He's not just Mr. Corporate. He's got a family. He's got neighbors. But the point is, it sounds like he's down to earth. He hangs out in his community. He's not just surrounded by bodyguards or some entourage or anything like that. It sounds like he's always gone out to be a normal guy. And if you think about it, what struck me about Steve Jobs is, remember, he's always wearing black jeans and a black casual turtleneck shirt. He is not, he's the CEO of the biggest company in the world, and you never see him in a suit and tie. You just see him in these casual clothes, and I think a lot of times he's wearing sneakers. So how cool is that? I mean, he's basically saying, look, this is a joke. This is a joke wearing a suit and a tie. What counts is making stuff. How one dresses at work shouldn't really be, an indication of their performance. So anyways, check out this article by Lysen Stromberg if you're interested in Steve Jobs and what he's like as a neighbor. Okay, one of the most remarkable stories this week is news that Apple may have lost another unreleased iPhone in a bar in San Francisco or those environments. Now, why is that interesting? That's interesting because if you remember last year, before the iPhone 4 came out, an Apple employee lost a prototype iPhone 4, and someone found it and sold it to Gizmodo, which then took pictures of it, and it became a big case because the local police, based on a complaint from Apple, investigated and ultimately is prosecuting 2 young men for misdemeanor violations. I guess, I don't know, the misdemeanor might be selling or receiving, stolen goods or something like that. And actually, those 2 individuals recently pled innocent to the misdemeanor charges, so it looks like they may fight it. But CNET reports that it seems to be a bizarre repeat of the incident last year. It says, in a bizarre repeat of a high-profile incident last year, an Apple employee once again appears to have lost an unreleased iPhone in a bar, CNET has learned. It says the errant iPhone, which went missing in San Francisco's Mission District in late July, sparked a scramble by Apple security to recover the device over the next few days, according to sources familiar with the investigation. So, they traced it to somebody's house, but the person didn't have the phone there. So it looks like there is another controversy. And you got to wonder, do you think this is like a publicity stunt by Apple, that Apple purposely loses the phone because it's part of the intrigue of the new iPhone coming out. A lot of people don't know what the iPhone 5 is going to look like. I doubt it's a publicity stunt because for such a publicity stunt, you could get in big trouble because obviously the police might investigate. So I seriously doubt it's a publicity stunt. But, am I surprised? No, because Apple has, way over 25,000 people. And there's a lot of people working there, and they probably want people to take prototypes of the iPhone 5 and test them in real life situations. It just happens that some of the people with anybody carrying a smartphone could be prone to losing the smartphone. So I feel bad for these employees who lose the phones. It's got to be highly embarrassing to go back to Apple and say, I don't have the prototype anymore. So we'll have to see what happens. Okay, so one of the things I want to talk about, we were talking about Steve Jobs, and I decided this week to read a book that came out actually originally in the 1980s, I guess around 1984 or so, by then a Time magazine writer named Michael Moritz. He then went on, the writer, to become, I guess, one of the most important venture capitalists in Silicon Valley at Sequoia Capital. But back then, he was just a Time magazine technology reporter. And he wrote what is now considered the definitive book on the early days of Apple. And I got to tell you, the book is a good read. It has a lot of detail. He obviously tracked down a lot of sources. He reissued the book in 2009. It cost $10 on the Kindle bookstore or the iBookstore, and it's a really good read. And there's some interesting stuff in there. One passage, in fact, really intrigued me, and I wrote about this on the blog. It's basically there's a passage in there that indicates that Apple was thinking about, or that Steve Jobs back in the early 80s was thinking about something like the iPad when he spoke to a group of students at Stanford. And this is what Moritz says in his book. And I say the cite's at page 1445 of 1762 on the iPhone edition of iBook of Return to Little Kingdom. And he says, and he's referring to Steve Jobs, he told the students about the company's Lisa computer, disclosed his dream of putting a computer in a book, and promised, we won't put garbage in a book because our competition will do that, end quote. So think about that. The Lisa is the computer that came out right before the Macintosh. So this is like, 83 or 82. And Steve Jobs is speaking to Stanford students, and he's basically saying he's dreaming of putting a computer in a book. Now, he might be thinking of what eventually become laptop computers, but isn't an iPad close to being like a computer in a book? It has the dimensions of a decent-sized book. It's thinner than a book. It really is like a computer in a book. So the iPad that we know of today could have been something that Steve Jobs was dreaming about. And, and it makes sense if you think about it. Like in the early days of computing, they're probably sitting around thinking, where is computing going to go in the far future? When the chips are smaller, when the processors are even smaller and they're faster. And so Steve Jobs probably has been dreaming of making the iPad for decades. And I don't know, it's a very interesting tidbit. Now, something else caught my attention in Michael Moritz's book about the early days of Apple. Now, Apple as a business was founded on April 1st, 1976 by Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. And the first Apple was very rudimentary, and the sales weren't that big, but it got the business off the ground. And then in, I guess, early 1977, they got some backing financially from this guy, Markkula. And Steve Jobs, immediately after the first year making the first Apple, made the Apple II. And the Apple II was really where Apple's business started taking off. But here's an interesting thing about the Apple II in the book. The Apple II really didn't take off until Steve Wozniak invented a floppy disk, external floppy disk drive and controller to work with the Apple II, because initially the Apple II was just like other companies' initial personal computers out there, and they didn't use a floppy drive. They used, I guess, a much slower using connection. So originally the Apple II, the operating system was contained and saved and loaded on a cassette tape, and it took a long time for the cassette tape to transfer the data and get the Apple II running. Remember, back then there were no such things as hard drives, let alone, I guess, floppy drives were just starting. But the initial PCs like the Apple I and the Apple II used these tape loading systems, which were really slow and quite cumbersome. And after the Apple II was released, a disk, floppy disks that were small were created, and there was a disk drive. And I think the Apple II was the first PC to work with an external disk drive. And Steve Wozniak created a disk operating system to operate that disk. And that, according to the book, that's when sales really took off, because it was just much faster to load the operating system and programs into the Apple II compared to its competition. So it was the first one to have like a floppy disk, an external floppy disk. Now remember, Apple always pushes the envelope in newer, better technology. Because remember, Apple was the first personal computer to have a mouse. Apple was the first personal computer to get rid of the floppy disk drive. Remember, in the 90s, I guess Apple got rid of the floppy drive and just went to having CDs and DVD drives as well as a hard drive. And so what's the significance of this? I think the significance is we are going through a similar transformation in computers right now. I think one of the real successes of the iPad and the iPhone is that they work off of SSD drives, flash storage. Flash storage, unlike regular hard drives, have no moving parts, and they're quicker. So the iPad, even though it only has like a 1 gigahertz dual-core processor, is very zippy. Like, you don't get a lot of lag. When you put it on and off, it goes on and off. And in part, a lot of that is this whole thing I was talking about before, the read-write access speed. And the MacBook Air that I have, the 11-inch, is amazing because of this fast read-write access of data. Like I said, if you look here, if you're looking at the video version of this podcast, I made a zone bench test, and I looked at the read-write speeds on this MacBook Air, and the file sizes are different amounts. The offsets range from 0 to 112 gigabytes. And look at here, basically the megabytes per second are pretty strong. They're between 221 megabytes per second and 246. Now, if you're looking on the screen, if you're looking at the mouse, on my iMac, which has a much faster processor, the read-write speeds are like around 80 or 70. So I'm tripling the speeds just by having this SSD drive. And the beauty is the new Macs have 6G eSATA. And what's this? Why is this significant? This is significant because the data speed is just much faster. So if we go here into the system specs under serial ATA, you see here the product is 6 series chipset, link speed 6 gigabits, negotiated link speed 3 gigabits. So what this means is that the internal SATA connection, which the SSD drive connects to, can handle 6 gigabits per second. And Apple, though, put in a Samsung SSD drive, 128 gigabyte one, that is only using the 3 gigabit speed, so half the speed. The point being, very soon, Apple's going to be putting probably a 6 gigabit SSD drive in its Macs, and then it's going to make it even twice as fast because the read-write speeds are going to go to 500. And as we see SSD drives get faster and faster, we're going to see the response time of these Macintoshes get better because it's not just processor speed. So we're going, and think about it, if you think about it, this whole transformation of going to SSD drives that are much faster than hard drives is similar to the transformation that went on in the late 70s when Apple abandoned the tape loading method of accessing data and went to the floppy drives, because it's just a quantum speed faster. And, I've been banging my head for years, for decades. I've been saying, why is it that computers, when you shut them down, why do they take so long to start up? I mean, I remember years ago, TVs, like long time ago, TVs took forever to warm up. You put them on and you had to wait for the screen to get the electricity to charge on. But then at some point, the technology advanced and you could just put the TV on, it was on. And I think we want that. And a lot of the personal computers that use regular hard drives, if you shut down your computer, it takes a while. It takes like a minute or two. And some corporate enterprise situations, it takes more than a minute or two. In the enterprise situation where I work, it can take like 10 minutes to get the computer going, because in addition to just sort of booting slowly through the hard drive, it's got all sorts of security things that it has to check with on a network. But my point is, we are going through right now a sort of a revolutionary period. I don't think you're going to see, I think you're going to see SSD drives come standard with all Macs. Right now, because of price, Apple has as the default on the iMacs and the MacBook Pros regular hard drives. And you can add an SSD drive in both the MacBook Pro or the iMac, but it's not the cheapest model. Apple made a statement with the MacBook Air, because with the MacBook Air, you only can get an SSD drive in it. And I can't tell you how high up I am on these SSD drives. I find it so frustrating to use my iMac, 27-inch iMac 2010 model, even though it has this tremendous processor. The processor I have on that is a quad-core i7 processor that allows hyper-threading of up to 8 cores. And so in terms of just if I converted a movie into another format, that's just going to race and be much faster in doing the conversion than the MacBook Air. But for everyday stuff, just launching apps, surfing the internet, putting the computer to sleep, putting the computer out of sleep, just everyday things, the MacBook Air, which has a processor half of what the iMac has, is much zippier. And that's because of this SSD drive. And my iMac, my 2010 iMac, has a 1 terabyte regular 7200 RPM hard drive, and I want to get an SSD drive in there. So my choices are to either ship it to OWC, this is the third-party company that can install a, let's say, like 112 or 112 gigabyte SSD drive for, like, I don't know, like $330 plus shipping. Or I was thinking of just selling my 2010 iMac and then buying from Apple a new iMac. The advantage of that is that the 2010 iMac does not have Thunderbolt, and the 2011 does have Thunderbolt. And I wouldn't be using the Thunderbolt now, but it's sort of future insurance. But I also, the new iMacs, as opposed to the 2010, do not have the 6 gigabit SATA connection internally, which means you can, the 2010 iMac, I can only upgrade to get a 3G SSD drive in there from OWC. Now, that's still fast, My MacBook Air only has a 3G and it's incredibly zippy. But I like having the option on my current MacBook Air of eventually upgrading it to the faster OWC 6 gigabit drive. But I guess my point is the future of computing, really, the area we're going to see performance is going to be in SSD drive together with battery life. The iPad's real breakthrough is one of the big breakthroughs is battery life together with speed. And so those are the two, big areas I see improvements. Okay, so one of the other cool things that I came across this week was in iTunes, of all places, I searched the name Steve Jobs and I found a speech that he made to students in June 1982. And it's just audio, but it's very interesting. And it's, I guess, 8 minutes long or so. And he's speaking at something called the Academy of Achievement. And he sounds really young. He was born in 1950. I think he was born in 1955. So he was in his late 20s, and he says stuff that are interesting. He said at one point to the students, quote, being in love with two people. He asked them if they've ever been in love with two people at the same time, sort of implying that he's been in love with two people at the same time. He also pointed out, and I'm not sure if he was joking, that Walt Disney once took LSD, and that inspired him to do Fantasia. So it's a free podcast on my blog at maxfuture.com. If you go to the post, I guess 3 days ago, I guess that would be Tuesday or Wednesday, last few days of August. You can check out the link, and it's pretty funny. You really do get a sense of just how down to earth he is, and how young he was back then, and his ability to relate with students. Okay, so finally, Mac Rumors has an interesting post. Actually, it's based on reporting by Foss Patents, a website that really does a great job tracking the patent wars between Apple and the Android device makers. But there's an interesting twist, according to Mac Rumors and Foss Patents, in the case, Apple's case against HTC, which is before the United States International Trade Commission. Apparently, Apple, in a recent court brief, claims that a key patent that's at issue in the case for real-time signal processing, API, which they claim HTA is accused of infringing, that Apple owned, was developed by a team of Apple engineers a while back, which include Android's co-founder and current Google executive Andy Rubin. Now, Andy Rubin, I guess, created Android, and Android was then acquired by Google, and he works at Google. But basically, Apple is sort of claiming that Andy Rubin was inspired for a lot of the stuff that's in Android through his work at Apple, which could mean, that if that's true, if Apple can trace that Rubin had access to, let's say, trade secrets, and that they were then used to make Android, there could be legal repercussions for Mr. Rubin and Google. So here's the quote from the legal brief. It says, Android and Mr. Rubin's relevant background does not start, as HTC would like the commission to believe, with his work at General Magic or Danger in the mid-1990s. In reality, as the evidence revealed at the hearing, Mr. Rubin began his career at Apple in the early 1990s and worked as a low-level engineer, specifically reporting to the inventors of the 263 real-time API patent at the exact time their invention was being conceived and developed. It is thus no wonder that the infringing Android platform used the claimed subsystem approach of the 263 patent that allows for flexibility of design and enables the platform to be highly customizable and expandable, as HTC touts. While Mr. Rubin's inspiration for the Android framework may not be directly relevant to the pending petitions for review, that HTC felt compelled to distort this history is illustrative of the liberties it takes in attacking the ALJ's initial determination, and the subsequent evidence supporting the ALJ's findings. So this is really interesting in terms of the battles that Apple is having to protect its intellectual property. On one hand, I do think that, people are quickly pulling the patent litigation trigger too quickly. On the other hand, I do believe that if a company like Apple has spent a lot of resources developing some sort of unique technology, not something obvious, but something truly unique, it should be protected. Now, one of the things, though, I would point out is that a lot of times people now think, in retrospect, that things were not unique when they were patented, like multi-touch displays. But that's in a way, I think, a trick on the mind, because I think something comes out that's just tremendous technology, like the iPad, where you can touch with your fingers and it works really well. And people think, well, that's an obvious concept. Well, that's the beauty of great technology. It just works so well that when you get it, you think it's obvious. But the thing is, if you go back in time, people didn't think it was obvious. People weren't writing it. People weren't saying, we're going to have these beautiful touch devices in the future. So I think the mind sort of plays a trick on people. Anyways, interesting post by Foss, Patent, and Mac Rumors. Okay, so that's it for this episode of the Apple Podcast. Again, this is Lex at maxfuture.com. Please check out the video version of this podcast on my YouTube channel, Max Future, and on YouTube, or on Blip TV, or under Apple Things and iTunes. And remember, this is a chit-chat-free podcast. We're just going to be talking about Apple-related stuff. Any support that you can give in the iTunes store or on YouTube in terms of positive comments or any sort of positive indications would be greatly appreciated. Again, I also have many Google Plus invitations left. So if you want an invitation to Google Plus and are curious about the platform, which I think is better than Facebook, just email me at maxfuture@gmail.com and I will promptly send you an invitation. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next week.
This has been a Max Future production.